Well, welcome to the 4 lectures that I'm going to be doing for you. This is part of Philosophical Problems, and I'm doing the introductory 4 philosophy lectures. My name's Andrew Brennan. The first 2 of the 4 lectures that I'm giving are going to be about problems of time and about the issues surrounding time travel. The next 2 lectures that I give, next Thursday and the following Tuesday, will be on problems of personal identity, which are actually very closely connected to problems about time travel. But today we're going to start with a series of problems and questions about time travel, and we're going to inquire into some very important and very little understood matters, such as who was Doctor Who's father? Does the notion of time travel make any sense at all? If time travel were possible, could we go back in time and change the past and thereby also change the present? And of course, there's the perennial problem. What on earth do people mean when they're talking about time travel? What is time travel? And so my 2 lectures are going to introduce some of these questions and others. And they're also going to do this from a purely philosophical point of view. That's to say, this is an introduction to the philosophy of time travel. It's not a technical subject, this. This is not an introduction to the physics or the mathematics of time travel. Rather, this is going to be looking at time travel from a purely philosophical point of view. So don't worry, there will be nothing technical and nothing difficult from a technical point of view in the lecture. Actually, there will be some difficulties in the lecture, partly because I'm likely to fall asleep, but also partly because some of the concepts are actually very difficult, and I'll have to try and not get muddled as I talk about them. And we'll see if I get on. In order to get the most out of these lectures, you need to remember to look at your textbook, The Philosophy Gym. You also need to look at 2 articles that are up on the LMS site. For people who are watching this lecture who are outside La Trobe, these articles are also available on the web. The first article that I'm going to look at is one by an old colleague of mine from Britain, Murray Macbeth, written some long time ago, but it does raise this very interesting and exciting question: who was Doctor Who's father? And this is a key question that I'll be looking at later in the lecture. There's a story in that paper on pages 388 to 389, and it's helpful if you can read that story before next Tuesday. I will hope to have time to say the outlines of that story during the lecture, just for the sake of those of you who can't get hold of the paper. The other paper I'm going to talk about, and I'll talk about an argument from it today, is David Lewis's paper, The Paradoxes of Time Travel. That paper is very widely and easily available on the web. It's only 7 pages long, but it's philosophically quite a difficult paper. The argument in it is quite condensed. It's very clear, but very condensed. But these are the 2 papers that we're going to look at. They'll be the papers for those of you who want to do essays on time travel. And also, you'll be able to look at chapter 4 of your textbook, The Philosophy Gym. Okay, let's think about time travel, and let's think about time. And let's, as is appropriate, start at the end and work backwards. Take the last question of the questions that I raised first. The question was, what is time travel? And the answer to that question is, of course, well, time travel is a bit like space travel. You and I are traveling in space all the time. When we're traveling around in space, we're going from one place to another, and we're going north, south, east, west. We're moving around in space all the time. Even as I stand here trying to stand still, I can't help moving a little bit in space because I'm twitching around and moving and changing my position. And it's likewise in time. If you think of the universe in terms of 4 dimensions, 3 spatial and 1 temporal, then we're moving in time as well. Actually, we're traveling in time even when we're sitting still. But when we talk about space travelers, we of course don't mean ordinary people. We mean people who do something exceptional in traveling in space. And likewise, when we talk about time travelers, we talk about people who are actually doing something exceptional in the way they travel in time. And the exceptional thing, as I'm going to point out in a short time, is easily described in this way. You could say that the duration of someone's journey in time usually matches the duration of time passing as measured by reference to everyone else. But suppose there were some people who were able to undertake journeys whose duration measured by their own physiological conditions, say by their heart rate, or say measured by watches that they're wearing, turns out to be different from the duration as measured by everyone else's physiological processes, aging, heart rate, and their watches. Then that person is doing something exceptional and unusual. The duration of their journey is different from the duration of the journeys of other people. And they're the people that we're going to be talking about as time travelers. And there's lots of cases of time travel. A very famous old literary one is H.G. Wells' account of the time machine. Those of you who've read Harry Potter books will remember that Hermione has a time turner that enables her to do the thing that you'd all like to do, go to twice as many lectures as anyone else. In relativity theory, there's a paradox known as the twins paradox, whereby one person ages much more slowly than their twin. And in the Doctor Who stories, which you may have seen on television, there's the police box that jumps in and out of the time vortex, the TARDIS it's called, and the TARDIS cranks and creaks and grinds and goes into this time vortex, and then does these unusual journeys, the duration of which is very different from the duration of the journey as measured by your time and my time. So we're all time travelers, but the time travelers I'm going to look at in this lecture are the people who are doing exceptional journeys in time. The duration of their journey doesn't quite stack up to the duration of your journeys and my journeys through time. So let's start with a simple case. We'll start with the twins paradox in relativity theory. Now, I did warn you that I wouldn't do anything technical, so just ignore the diagram there and just think about the story. Suppose you've got two twins born at exactly the same time, Tommy and Tammy. Tommy and Tammy are twins. Tommy stays on Earth, but Tammy, being a courageous and brave person, flies off on a spaceship at 0.86 of the speed of light. Now, just in keeping with my claim that this is not a technical subject, we will say that that's flying very, very, very fast. So Tammy is off on her spaceship, flying very fast, while Tommy just lives an ordinary life with a journey through time that matches the journeys through time of all the other people around about him. Now, after 10 Earth years have passed, since Tommy is not exceptional in his voyaging through time, Tommy is just 10 years older than he was. But amazingly enough, Tammy's watch and Tammy's body aging processes show that, in fact, she's only 5 years older since leaving Earth. So that's to say it's as if she's living at half the rate of her brother. So there's the Millennium Falcon. You know, spaceships are always supposed to be doing this. I mean, in all the movies you watch, spaceships are always going at warp speed and light speed and space normal speed and subnormal speed and supernormal speed. So, of course, it's something we're actually very familiar with from the movies, the thought that people's journeys are exceptional. So suppose they're separated at the age of 20. Suppose Tammy goes away into space for 25 years. At least 25 years by her body time, by her physiological time. She'll find then that life on Earth has moved on 50 years. So when she comes back to Earth, she doesn't find that her brother's 25 years older than her. She doesn't find that her brother's aged 25 years. She finds her brother has aged 50 years. That means that she is 45 when her brother Tommy is 75. Wow. How is that possible? Can that work? Okay, let's think about it. Would we say that Tammy has traveled in time in this situation? Now, in the physics textbooks that discuss this situation, they often talk about this as a case of time travel because they say this is a case where Tammy's proper time, and they use the phrase proper time, where Tammy's proper time is different from the external time in which her brother Tommy has been living. Now, what's puzzling about this is that Tammy hasn't done quite the things that happen when you go into the TARDIS with Doctor Who. She's not done this journey very, very, very abruptly. She hasn't jumped into the future, as we'll say. And it's the fact that she's not jumped into the future that makes some people think that this would not be a real case of time travel. In the literature, what's happened to Tammy is called sliding into the future rather than jumping into the future. So she's a time slider. Now just follow this thought through, that she's gone away for some time in the spaceship, she comes back to Earth. And let's suppose that both of the twins, by their own biological clocks, by their own body processes and their own watches, suppose they twins live to be 80 years old. That's to say they both die at the same physiological age. Nonetheless, in terms of time as measured external to them, they die at different times. And this is where we start to get really puzzled and intrigued. And the first thing you have to ask is this an absurd thing to say? And the answer you give is, no, this is not an absurd thing to say. It's not absurd because I can draw a diagram that makes sense of this. And it doesn't need to be one of these frightening physics ones. It can be a simple space-time diagram. On the vertical axis, we put time. And on the horizontal axis, we put space. And so we've collapsed all three spatial dimensions simply into one dimension running along the horizontal axis. But the diagram is meant to represent our journeys through a four-dimensional reality of space and time. And for simplicity, when I'm drawing this diagram, I won't actually draw wiggly lines to represent people going through space, which is probably what you should do to show them moving one way and then another way. I'll just collapse these into straight lines. So there you are. We've got our diagrams up on the screens. There's the year 2000, and Tommy's born. But of course, that's the very same year in which his twin sister Tammy is also born. So Tommy and Tammy are born at exactly the same time. Now, is there anything very strange going to happen here? Well, in 2020, excuse me, when the twins are both 20 years old, see, I've made it easy to count, it's not too technically demanding, 2020. When the twins are both 20 years old, Tommy just goes on wandering around on Earth. His line should be wiggling, but I've just done a straight line for simplicity. Wandering around on Earth, living in the same time as you and me and everyone else. But Tammy, brave explorer that she is, has done something different. In 2070, Tommy, who's stayed on Earth, is now 70, 2070. But Tammy, in the meantime, has been rushing off into space. And by the calculation we did on the slide before, you'll remember that when Tommy is 70, Tammy is only 45, thanks to this strange effect of the slowing down of time, as it were, in her own proper or personal time in her space journey. Okay, well, Tommy goes on and lives for another 10 years and dies happily at the age of 80. But Tammy was 45 when she came back to Earth. So how many more years does she have to live here on Earth in order to die at 80? 35, thank you very much. So she will die in... Sorry, this is an opportunity for you to respond. She will die in 2105. Thank you. So they both die at the age of 80, but in terms of our external time, they die at different times. And yet, if you look at the diagram as I've drawn it there, it doesn't look all that hard to explain or hard to understand. It's just that Tammy's had this experience that enabled her to live in external time longer than Tommy. And I want to count Tammy as a case of time traveling. I want to count her as having slid into the future. So Tammy has been a time slider. She's slid into the future. Okay, well, this example is just meant to get your minds working around this idea and thinking about this idea and saying, well, this is actually not all that weird. Now that you can draw a diagram and make sense of it, it's okay. Now, in your textbook, The Philosophy Gym, the writer talks about the possibility of taking slow pills that slow down your body processes and expresses some doubt as to whether this is a form of time travel. But my view is that if we accept Tammy as a time travel case, if we accept her as a time traveler, then if Tammy has slid into the future, then the slow pills mentioned in the Philosophy Gym are also a way of traveling into the future. And so are freezers and other forms of suspended animation like you get in films like Alien, the Alien franchise and so on. I tried to draw an emu in a freezer just to make the point that even emus could have this experience if we could suspend their animation. And then I got confused and I thought it might be a Doctor Who emu, and I put it into a time vortex instead. And that's why the emus turned out rather distorted and strange looking in the freezer. Anyway, it will remind you that freezers and suspended animation are forms of time sliding. But the trouble with that way of doing time travel, the problem with that, is of course that this form of time travel is very limited. It limits you to going into the future and seeing bits of the future that the people living around you have no expectation of ever seeing because they are living in regular time. Your proper time has been different from theirs. And of course, what you're really interested in, or what philosophers are really interested in, are the possibilities raised by traveling the other way into the past. So time sliding limits you to travel into the future, but we've learned one thing from thinking about this case, and that's the thing that's quite important in the next discussion. That's the difference between what we might call particular or personal time. That's the traveler's own time as measured by their heartbeats, their aging processes, their body physiology, the watch they are carrying when they're in the time machine. There's the distinction between that, personal or particular time, and external time, the time that's measured by the Greenwich clock or some other standard external time measure. Okay, I hope that my cold, muddled state hasn't confused you and that this is clear so far. Is this clear so far? Are you with me? More or less? With some hesitations and worries and concerns, but by and large with me. Good. So the next thing is to think about time travel in two directions, into the future and into the past. If there were time machines like Doctor Who's TARDIS, then they would let us jump in two directions across external time. They'd let us jump into the future and they'd let us jump into the past as well. The TARDIS isn't the only machine in fiction that does that. Hermione's time turner in the Harry Potter stories does exactly the same. Now, of course, the question that we ask about these cases when we read these books and we think about them philosophically is not whether Harry Potter novels and Doctor Who stories tell us about what is scientifically possible. The question that I want you to focus on is not, is that a scientific reality? Is that really going to happen one day? Is there going to be a day when this actually comes about, time travel will be commonplace? What we want to think about instead is this even something that's imaginable in a coherent and consistent way? So the philosophical question that I want to get you to focus on is the question about the kind of world that is being described in these time travel stories. They obviously describe a world that's very different from the world as we know it, the world that we understand. So the philosophical question I've got is not, will one day these things be made? That's the kind of question about fact, about science, about technology. The question I want you to ask is, instead, the question, is such a world possible? And in the philosopher's sense of the word possible, what I mean by saying is such a world possible is, can it be consistently described? Can you describe it, in other words, without contradicting yourself? Is it possible to describe this world without contradiction? And that's the key matter. Whether it's scientifically possible or not, that's for the technologists, scientists, and inventors to come up with and decide. It may turn out that a world that we think is consistent and can be described coherently we might come to the view that such a world can be described without a contradiction, but at the same time, it might turn out to be scientifically impossible to realize it. So it's going to be the case that it might be that philosophy goes beyond science. We say, oh, there's no incoherence in thinking about a world like this, but nonetheless, it cannot be described without contradiction. Okay, so that's what I'm going to focus on. And the first question I'm going to ask about describing a world without a contradiction is a problem raised in the David Lewis paper that I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture on paradoxes of time travel, and that's the problem of the grandfather. And it's a problem that haunts a lot of discussions on time travel, and so I'll describe it to you, and then I'll give you a possible solution to it. So our philosophical question was, is it possible to describe a world with time travel in it in such a way that there are no inconsistencies and no contradictions in the stories we tell? Tim's grandfather, according to David Lewis's story, has made a fortune selling armaments and living a very unethical life on the proceeds from this wicked arms trade he's engaged in. And Tim grows up to hate his grandfather so much that he would like to kill him. Unfortunately, his grandfather's dead because he died while Tim was a teenager. Nonetheless, Tim forms this view that he really would like to kill his grandfather because he hates what his grandfather did to the world. So he decides that he'll jump into a time machine and go back and kill him. So the grandfather died in 97, and Tim is now thinking how to kill him. Well, here's one way that Tim can do it. He can jump into the time machine, he can go back, and he can exact his revenge for all the nasty things his grandfather did and all the horrors he did to the world. So Tim actually goes back to 1951. I've changed the dates. For those of you who read the David Lewis paper, I've brought it up to date a bit by making the dates more recent than in Lewis's paper. Anyway, the dates don't matter. Tim goes back to 1951, which actually happened to be before his grandfather met his grandmother. Therefore, before his grandfather and grandmother got together, therefore, before they conceived a child that was either his father or his mother, and therefore, this is quite an exciting time to go back to. He takes a gun with him, or maybe after he gets back in the time machine, he buys a gun, and he spends a lot of time becoming an expert shot. So he's got his gun anyway. He's lined up. His grandfather's coming down a trail 20 meters away from him. He's ready to shoot his grandfather. But wait! Horrific thought comes to mind. If he succeeds in shooting his grandfather, then he will have himself made sure that neither, if it's his paternal grandfather, I imagine in this case it's the paternal grandfather, if he succeeds, then there'll be no father. There'll be no one to father Tim because his grandfather's not yet met his grandmother. So there'll be no father. If there's no father, there's no Tim. That's really weird. What is he going to do? Does he kill his grandfather? Now, some people have said just thinking about this story means that any attempt to describe time travel in the way that I've described it so far is going to be incoherent and inconsistent. So I'll just give you an example of an incoherent story before I go back to solve the grandfather problem. One of the problems about time travel is thinking, if we go back and change the past, what about the present and all the things that happened leading up to the present? Okay, let's go to another movie, Back to the Future. Has anyone seen Back to the Future? How amazing. It's such an old movie, and yet you've all seen it. And this is a much awarded film. It was much liked by President Ronald Reagan. It showed a can-do spirit, even changing the future when necessary. But the trouble with Back to the Future's plot, from the point of view of the philosopher, is that in Back to the Future, things happen and don't happen at the very same time. The hero, if you recall the first movie, Marty McFly, is actually told in that movie by his mum that she first met his dad, who's called George, when his dad, George, was hit by a car driven by her father. But in the movie, Marty actually travels back to the key date, which is the 5th of November, 1955, and changes history, because when he sees his father-to-be about to be run over by the car, he pushes his future father out of the way and gets hit by the car himself. And then all sorts of exciting things happen. His future mother starts to take an interest in him and starts to behave in flirtatious and romantic ways. Now, this can't happen. Back to the Future was meant as a family film. So we're not going to follow that line of thought very far in the movie, are we? We're going to be very careful about that. So Marty has to ensure that he doesn't end up marrying his own mother and becoming his own father or something horrendous like that. That's just not got to be allowed. This is Hollywood. So what happened on the 5th of November 1955? Well, actually, there's two versions of what happened on the 5th of November 1955, and they're both inconsistent with each other. In the original story, George, Marty's father, is hit by a car, and that means that Marty is not hit by the car. On the other hand, when Marty travels back, Marty is hit by a car, but that means George is not hit by a car. But then on the 5th of November 1955, it's either got to be the case that George is hit by a car or Marty is hit by a car. The story of the movie seems inconsistent. It seems to imply that Marty was hit by a car and also that Marty was not hit by a car. And that's what I meant earlier when I talked about inconsistency. The plot of this movie seems to hinge on a contradiction. Now, next week in the second lecture, I'll actually say a bit more about this kind of contradiction puzzle and show that there's another way of thinking about time travel from the way I've introduced in this lecture and from the way that David Lewis and Mary Macbeth think about it. But until we think about time travel in that other way, then I'm going to stick with the thought that this movie has an inconsistent storyline. Marty's hit by a car and he's not hit by a car. George is hit by a car and he's not hit by a car. These are contradictions, and they make the story much less plausible. Indeed, incoherent, impossible. Okay, with that in mind, let's go back to the grandfather. Back to the Future story might itself be incoherent or inconsistent in some way because it seems to describe an impossible situation, a situation in which something happens and also that thing does not happen. So what about the grandfather problem? Is it also inconsistent in the way that it's trying to describe something that happens and something that does not happen? And the answer, I think, to this question is to say no. And David Lewis gives a detailed solution to the problem in his paper. And so when you look at the paper, you'll see the detailed solution. I'll just skim over it, assuming that over the weekend you'll be so excited by thinking about time travel that you'll want to go away and read David Lewis's paper and Mary Macbeth's paper on time travel. Okay, let's go back to where we were with the grandfather story. Tim was all lined up in 1921, ready, not 1921, 1951. I forgot to change that date. Tim was all lined up in 1951, ready to shoot his grandfather. He can shoot his grandfather in the sense that, and you have to be wary here because the word can may be ambiguous, he can shoot his grandfather in the sense that he's got the gun is loaded, he's a capable shot, he's able to do it. So he has the gun, the bullets, the skill, and so on. But I think we have to say in this case, given that Tim exists, then whatever happened on that fateful day back in 1951, he just did not shoot his grandfather. Because Tim already exists. Since he exists, his father exists. Since his father exists, then his grandfather did meet his grandmother, and that means his grandfather was not shot. Now, Lewis argues in his paper that when you think about the case in the way that I've just described it, there is no contradiction or impossibility here. There's a strangeness that someone who's all lined up with their gun ready to shoot doesn't actually fire the fatal shot. That's strange, but it's not contradictory. It could be that a wasp stung him. It could be that he was distracted by a fly. It could be that he had a sudden wave of conscience. It could be a dozen things that stopped him killing his grandfather. What we do know is that he didn't kill his grandfather. Why not? Because he's real and he exists. So why is there no problem in this case? Well, here's another way of thinking about the case and making sense of it. Instead of Tim going back in time to kill his grandfather, suppose there was someone at the time who bore his grandfather a grudge, someone who was a very good and accurate professional assassin. Let's call him Mr. Smith, just for fun. A guy called Mr. Smith was all lined up and ready to kill Tim's grandfather too. And Mr. Smith, make no mistake about it, was a very good shot. He was all lined up. And he was ready to shoot Tim's grandfather before the grandfather got together with the grandmother. Well, it's the same story, isn't it? Smith could have shot the grandfather. He has the gun, he has the bullets, he has the skill and so on. But we do know one thing, which is that for whatever reason, Smith did not in fact shoot the grandfather. How do we know that? Because otherwise there would be no Tim. And again, as in the other case, we have no idea why Mr. Smith fails to shoot the grandfather. But if we're going to keep our stories consistent, this consistent story says he didn't shoot the grandfather. I think the moral of this case is that we should tell only one story at a time. And if we're careful, we can tell quite consistent, even though quite loopy, time travel stories. And that's particularly the case of the story given by Murray Macbeth. And what I'm going to do in the last 5 minutes or so of this lecture, let you out of this hell where there is no air conditioning, is I'll go over Murray Macbeth's story. At least I'll go over a simple version of it for the sake of those who can't get hold of the paper. So are we strong enough to go through yet another weird story? I'm not. I didn't sleep last night. I'm having great difficulty getting through the next 10 minutes without sneezing my head off. But luckily there are drugs, and I'm drugged to the eyeballs. If there is a drug that stops sneezing or that stops coughing, I've taken it. And I took them all between 4 o'clock this morning and 9 o'clock this morning. And it's amazing I'm still standing up. Okay, now those of you who are following on your computers will have no trouble. Those of you in the lecture theatre will have some trouble, because I fear, given the wonderful distance of the screen from you, that we're actually going to have too small a diagram. But I'll talk about it. This is Murray Macbeth's story in the Who Was Doctor Who's Father case. And it's based on an example originally invented by Jonathan Harrison, an English philosopher. And what's interesting about Macbeth's story is that it contains both jumps and slides. It's other interesting things about it. It also explains who Doctor Who is and how he comes to be and who his father is. So it's really exciting. But I have to warn you that the next 5 minutes is not family viewing, because there's some horrible things happening. There's going to be cannibalism. There's going to be patricide. There's going to be incest. So this is not Back to the Future. This is hardcore philosophy. Okay, here's time-space diagram again. Time on the vertical, space on the horizontal axis. And this time our story starts in 1984. 1984. And it's set in the Northern Territory of Australia, strangely enough, although the article was written in Scotland and published in a European journal. Anyway, it happens that Annabel Watt, I don't know why she's called Annabel Watt, but maybe it's got something to do with Doctor Who. Annabel Watt is wandering around in the Northern Territory prospecting with her metal detector and finds a strange mound of earth, inside of which she finds an obsolete model of freezer hooked up to a solar generator. Opening the freezer, she finds a very nice young man who appears to be about 21. And he's in a state of suspended animation. We don't know how she does it, but Annabel defrosts him. And when he defrosts, she actually finds his company rather exciting and interesting. So 3 months later, they are married. And very shortly thereafter, they have a child. The main problem with her newfound love and the father of her child is that he has no memory of how he came to be in the freezer. So Arthur is amnesic. And she's whimsical, Annabel. when she can't think of a name for him, she gives him the name Arthur, and then she thinks, what's his family name? And she says, well, I'll call him Who. So Annabel What and Arthur Who. And the child is born in 1985, after their marriage, and I've not had space on the diagram to write 1985, so I've just put another dotted line above the timeline for 1984. Now I'm going to do two different colours of lines here. The yellow line is the life history of Arthur. Remember that Arthur was already 21, so that's not his birth date. He was already found in the freezer by Annabel. The green line is the young Who. And the young Who actually turns out to be a very talented engineer and scientist. And by the time he's 16, he's got a swathe of PhDs in various things. And he's actually in the midst of building a time machine with the help of his dad. So Doctor Who was born in 1985. By 2001, he's got his PhD and his time machine, and he and his father set off on the maiden voyage of the time machine, which happens to be called the TARDIS, and happens to be built in the shape of an old British police box, a bit of whimsy that he inherits from his mum. So Doctor Who and his father enter the TARDIS in 2001. Now, I'm going to show the kind of jump by doing a horizontal line, just to show that they're now, at this point, going to suddenly go somewhere else. They set the TARDIS controls so they can travel back in time. They aim to travel back to 1961. They take enough food for the voyage, because by Arthur's calculations, it turns out that in order to get back to 1961, the TARDIS will have to be locked with them inside it for 6 months of their time. So they take 6 months' supply of food. Lock the doors, bid farewell to Annabel, then lock the doors, and then off they go. And just remember, Doctor Who at this moment is 16, the young doctor. Well, there's his timeline. He goes shooting back into the past in the TARDIS. But unfortunately, there's something wrong with the circuitry and the machinery. The TARDIS doesn't stop at 1961. It goes all the way back to 1941. And here's his dad's timeline. Oh, you'll see that his father doesn't survive the voyage. Because what happens is, because they'd only packed 6 months' food runs out, because getting back to 1941 has taken a year of their time. It's taken 1 year of their personal or proper time. And the only way that Arthur could survive was by killing and eating his father. It's one of these situations where the old have to make a sacrifice for the young. So that's in 1951 in external time that the father dies, and young Doctor Who continues his pioneering and exciting voyage. And here's the excuse he was going to give the magistrate when he got back to the Northern Territory. They didn't pack enough food for a 12-month voyage. Sorry about that, Dad. And so to make it graphic, I've just illustrated the point where Doctor Who eats his dad. I told you this was not a family story. It gets worse. By the time he arrives back in 1941, it's taken a year of proper time, measured by his watch, by his physiological processes, for Arthur to get there. And he's now 17, because he was 16 when he entered the TARDIS, and he's now 17 when he comes out. Okay, there's the horizontal line showing he comes out. For a few years, not many, Doctor Who wanders around trying to find parts that will repair the TARDIS, because he doesn't want to go back into the time machine when it's malfunctioning. He doesn't want to run the risk of another disastrous voyage, especially when he's got no one along to eat. So he looks, but there are no parts in early 1940s Northern Territory that will repair an advanced time machine. There's another story about Doctor Who that says that in this period he travels the galaxy doing all sorts of deeds of daring do and saving the just and the righteous as a way of expiating the guilt he felt about eating his dad. But Macbeth tells us that the true story is that he just wandered around looking for parts for the TARDIS and failing. So what he does is he rigs up a temporary time machine using the material available at the time, namely a freezer and a solar generator. And in 1945, he actually builds and enters the freezer, locks himself in, and goes into a state of suspended animation. He's now 21. Oh, that's funny. Wasn't that the same age as someone found by Annabelle? So there's the little horizontal line show he's in the freezer. There's the next line to show that he lay in that freezer until 1984, when Annabelle Watt was out with her metal detector. She encountered a mound of earth, and inside she found an obsolete freezer with a young man inside it. Oh, but look, there's something very strange about this story, and this is what I'd like you to think about before the next lecture, because I've coloured the lines in two different colours. I had a yellow line for Arthur Senior, the older Who, and I've got a green line for the history of Doctor Who, Arthur Jr., the brilliant genius who had his PhD in engineering at 14. But actually, there shouldn't be two lines here. There should be just one. Because after all, who was it that Annabelle pulled out of the freezer if it wasn't the person that she goes on to marry and have a child with, who turns out to be a genius and builds a time machine called the TARDIS? Isn't that puzzling? And the puzzling thing about Macbeth's story, and the thing that Macbeth spends most of his article describing, is how this story might seem bizarre, certainly horrific, might seem bizarre and unusual, but it's not contradictory. There is actually no contradiction involved in telling this story. Even though it turns out that, for example, in 1984, the same one person is in multiple locations. That person is both in a time machine and also being born and also the father of himself. And so in the next lecture, we'll have to unpick some of these puzzles and say, is it really the case that this kind of idea about time machine can be made sense of in a non-contradictory way? Thank you for your patience and tolerance, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Bye.